One of the pet peeves that I have is that Republicans always say, especially to blacks, if you want to succeed in America, all you have to do is get an education. If you just go and get an education, you'll succeed. And I always ask them, what if it's a progressive education? What are they going to get, or what are they going to benefit if they're not getting the true history because it's masked in progressive lies? I call this a SSSA education, where they teach us about slavery, segregation, socialism, and assassination. Basically, the history of the Democratic Party without context or acceptance of their evil deeds. Tell your intellectual kind of concept of what was going on and what created the Democratic Party.
Well, slavery, the institution of slavery, is very old. It goes back to the dawn of mankind. What the Democrats invented is something called the positive good school of slavery, the defense of slavery, the justification of slavery. The reason the Democrats needed to come up with a justification is that the Republicans were on the attack. They were attacking slavery, and the Democrats needed to defend it. So the Democratic Party became the official defender of slavery for 50 years. Now, not just in the South, because the Democrats have been very clever about blaming the South, but the Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois and later a Democratic Party candidate for president, he was the Northern Democratic defender of slavery. The Democrats defended slavery both in the North and in the South.
And in that entire process, because that's where they get us, they want us to specifically break everything up, like I said, out of context, North versus South, and not the actual fight that was going on freedom-wise about not having slavery in America. We keep talking about it and we keep bringing slavery up, but one of the biggest things that I like to cover is the period of Reconstruction. What happened immediately after slavery was over? See, because that's where we get stuck, like I said, with the intellectual, and we forget what was happening culturally. So during that period of Reconstruction, the Democrats, the ones that were formed the Democratic Party, the ones that were formed the KKK, they went through a cultural upheaval because every single thing that they had known their entire life had been snatched away from them with the defeat in the Civil War. So they, like you said, they had justified slavery. Now all of their causes for justification had been taken away. So they had said God had intended for whites to rule over slaves, and their laws proved that that was not true. Their historical people, all the Confederates that had came before them, had ruled America through the cotton trade, and that was their history, their economic basis, and that had been taken away from them. Their cultural norms, as they were in a community where black people are supposed to look down, not look us directly in our face when they walk across our path, that too was taken away. So like everything culturally about these Southern, not just Southerners, but mostly in the South, Democrats at the time, was taken away. And culturally, they sought something. They sought out something, and they found a cure for that in progressivism. Do you think that that's the case?
There was an intermediate stage before progressivism really got flowering in the early 20th century. The way to think about this is that slavery was an unbelievably fantastic ripoff scheme. It was a theft scheme. Abraham Lincoln put it very well when he said it can be summarized as "you work, I eat." Slavery is getting another guy to work for you for free for his whole life. So when this theft scheme was busted up, just as you say, the Democrats were in total disarray, and they needed to come up with a new theft scheme because that's who they are and this is what they do. So they came up with segregation, Jim Crow, lynching, and the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay, you moving too fast. We wanna, like I said, we have to put this in context because then our words can't be taken out of their context. So we go from the Civil War, we go through Reconstruction, because this is the point that I wanted to make before we jump into segregation. During this period, the American government was not segregated. During this period, the American military was not segregated. During this period, Booker T. Washington was going around preaching the philosophy of we don't need to force anything. All we need to do as black people is make ourselves so indispensable that America will understand our value, and that is how we will integrate into society. That we have to make ourselves the best that we can be, and then they'll have no choice but to accept us as being here. During this time period was one of the most prosperous time periods for black people. Education-wise, we were killing it. Economic-wise, we were killing it. Our family structure was put together. We were building Black Wall Street. This was an economic boom time for black people. And I want to make sure I insert that when people ask, when was America ever great for black people? This was our window. This is what we had at the time where we actually flourished, and we take advantage of it. And one of the things I always like to point out is that they would call this the Booker T. Washington age. They would call this the age of blackness coming to its awareness in America. And then you get President Woodrow Wilson and the birth of progressivism in America.
Yeah, during Reconstruction, there were 22 African Americans in Congress. There were black senators. And remember, the Republican Party was the champion of the African American cause. The Republicans had pushed through the 13th Amendment ending slavery permanently, the 14th Amendment granting equal rights under the law, and the 15th Amendment granting the right to vote. So think about this. All the important rights that had to be secured 100 years later in the civil rights movement of the 60s were already secured and put into the Constitution by the Republican Party in the teeth of almost uniform Democratic Party opposition in the 1860s.
So I know we have a lot to cover, so I'm just trying to push through. I wish we had more depth that we could go through all of this, like more. But we come through to Woodrow Wilson. And like I said, I want to match up the cultural, what was happening culturally in the black community, what was happening politically and intellectually. When you come up out of the Reconstruction period, and I talked about the prosperity that blacks were having, one of the things that a lot of black families did was the same thing that white families were doing. They were sending their kids abroad. With this new influx of money that was in the black community, they could now afford to send their kids overseas. Now, overseas was the breeding ground for Marxism. And the blacks would go overseas to Russia, to Italy, to Germany, and they would be treated like rock stars. They would be presented with this system that they said was far superior to the capitalism of America because it gave them the equality that they were lacking in America. Like the idea of Marxism itself, before it came to America and penetrated itself as progressivism. How sick is it that isn't taught in our school system, just the basic tenets of Marxism?
Yeah, the 20th century was defined by three collectivist movements that were cousins of each other. Fascism in Germany, Marxism and communism in Russia, and then progressivism in Europe and in America. Today, we think of progressivism as different from the other two, but at the time, even the progressives saw their affinities, their similarities with not only with communism and Marxism, but with fascism. A young JFK went to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and he came back effusive with praise of Hitler. FDR sent members of his brain trust to Italy to study Italian fascism under Mussolini. And not only did FDR admire Mussolini, but Mussolini loved FDR. He reviewed FDR's book in an Italian magazine, and he goes, "Great, this guy's one of us. He's a fascist like me." So all of this happened before the war. And after the war, after World War II, progressives decided this is all super embarrassing. We don't want our progressive heroes like JFK and FDR to be besmirched in this way by the truth. Let's cover up the truth. Let's leave it out of the textbook so young people aren't exposed to this stuff. And this is part of the progressive cover-up that I unmask in this movie, Hillary's America, and in the accompanying book.